The following is a conversation with Chris White. I met Chris years ago. I believe it was at SIGGRAPH. But way before that, I was aware of Chris' work at Weta for King Kong, of which there was a long making-of interview online. I was blown away by the pioneering spirit of the code-based approach for 3D modeling New York in 1935 that Chris chose, but especially regarding the particle-based system for weathering the building's textures, which led myself to experiment with a similar approach using RealFlow. Earlier this year, in April 2024, I met Chris again in Nairobi, Kenya at the first ever Visage Visual Effects Creative Festival, which is organized by my friend Yvonne, whom you may know of episode 2 of the podcast. And then also a few weeks later at FMX in Stuttgart, Germany, I met Chris again, which then actually led me to invite him to the podcast. Chris has incredible talents, is super calmly spirited, and has a magical way to inspire people. It is an honor to have you on, Chris. Thank you so much for your time. Stay humble, stay curious. This is the 3D Environment Podcast. And now, please enjoy the conversation with Chris White. Okay, so Chris, it's an honor to have you on.
Yeah, it's good to finally do this. I know we talked about it for a little bit. Germany and Africa and all the other places that we met up. So it's good to finally sit down and do it.
It's awesome. Yeah, no, thank you so much for the opportunity. Also for the people that make it possible on your end. That's super amazing. Yeah. Sweet. So, I mean, you are, I would say, very, very famous in some circles, like visual effects and so on.
About that.
Yes, you are. And but on the maybe some other people from other industries that also work with 3D environments, they might not know much about you. So I would say let's talk a little bit about your background. So can you give us a little bit of a background where you are coming from and kind of what field of education you chose to kind of get everything rolling?
Yeah, going back to that, I had, like in high school, I was studying a little bit of computer science and engineering, but, and this was in the 90s, so this goes back a while. And it was literally, I was taking a course at George Washington University because I grew up right around Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. And I saw some computer graphics of, it was just some rigid bodies of these, a professor was like bouncing these chairs down the stairs. And this was even new back then. And I immediately saw it and I thought, oh, this is cool. This is something different I want to do. So I had actually changed tact from looking at engineering schools and computer science to look for computer art schools. And there was only a few on the East Coast of the U.S. at that time. There wasn't a lot of schools teaching it. I went to Syracuse University and I started studying computer art there, which was under the School of Art. But we took computer science and math classes and things like that. And so I studied there. It was, several years, but toward the end of our internship, and this kind of leads to how I got in the industry, was that we had someone from ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, come and visit and give a little talk about the company and their work. And I think it was Carl Frederick, if I remember it right. And he was showing all of it. And then he had mentioned that ILM had an internship. And so all of us thought, oh, this is interesting. Maybe we should try for it. And a good friend of mine tried for it. And he got the internship that year and came back and talked about how great it was. Now, the thing was, like, at that time, we thought maybe the most we could do with computer graphics was doing different things. Like, we were doing some artistic things we were doing with it. And we were also looking at, like, weather graphics and stuff. We weren't even thinking about special effects as being that much of a career. But then he came back and started speaking about all the things that ILM was doing. And this was shortly after, I guess, Jurassic was a couple years before it. And some of the Terminator 2 stuff was years before that. And so I guess to make it not such a super long story, but I had applied for that internship like 2 or 3 years in a row. Always got really close to getting it, but never getting it. Like literally, Like they would say, oh, there's 800 applicants and you were number 2 or, things like that. So I never had got it there. But then after finishing school and I went to grad school, I said, you know what, I'm going to try one more time. I'm going to apply for it again. And that year I had gone to grad school in Chicago and I was making particle systems, which is something I was interested in, but I was making artistic tools for people who may not want to get into the coding and the physics of math to do particles. So doing a lot of vortexes and doing kind of virtual reality and doing these vortexes. And that one year was the same year they had gotten the film Twister. So my demo reel as an intern was all these big vortex-looking things. And I ended up getting the internship that year at ILM and continued on to do, stayed on past it. But the reason I think I bring that up was because all those years before I had gotten that internship, I was always upset because I was getting very close, And it was just like, oh, why not this year? And disappointed and having to go back home and all kinds of things. But the year I did get it, my portfolio was perfect for what they were doing. So the thing I kind of take with that point is that sometimes you have stuff that happens that you think is bad or it happens, for the wrong. You're upset. And why didn't this work out for me? But if I'd gotten it any of those other years, I probably wouldn't have ended up continuing on and working there. The year I did get it was ideal for what I ended up doing.
Beautiful story about just be persistent in life, right?
Exactly.
Follow your passions. So regarding the particle systems and the research that you did, I mean, in the mid-90s, I think early versions of Maya were already available. Which tools did you use for the particle tests for your work with particles? And what caught ILM's eye in your specific approach to simulate particle system?
Yeah, and the thing is, this was even pre-Maya, because I think Maya didn't come in for a couple more years. This was back, when I was doing it in Syracuse, we were just coding it ourselves. There was these amazing artists like Carl Sims, I think, who was doing this genetic creatures, just programming them on these SGI machines. Dynamation had come out that Jim Horahan had written. That's what we used for Twister, which was just particles. And he had written his own language called Sophia, where you could program all the code for the tornadoes. But this was pre-Maya, so it was Dynamation, really. And to your question about what might have attracted them to my portfolio, I think it was because my thesis, and it's been my thesis all the way through now to Weta, is that if you can make tools, great tools that are artist-friendly, there's all kinds of things you could do. And my master's thesis was you can have very complex physics, but if you put a nice interface to it and you give things that the artists want to be able to use, they can do a lot with it. And that was my job on Twister, was that while the supervisors were making some of the math and the code, I was building the whole interface so that all the TDs could direct their tornadoes, sliders, widgets, splines, all kinds of things, so you could art direct the tornadoes, which was, I was making $4 an hour. So that was just an intern with all of, all of that show that was kind of resting on that code.
That's very cool, which also kind of reminds me a little bit of my longer-ish journey to get into Houdini. And one of the kind of fundamental things to understand for me or to learn for me was that in certain tools or with certain artist-friendly workflows, it's really important to kind of distinguish between just a visual result that mimics basically a physical phenomenon like fire or explosions or rigid body simulations. And you have to trick the eye, but it's not the same thing as literal physics-based simulation. That would be way, way, way too complex because you cannot, simulate all the single atoms that eventually with all the chemical processes and so on. And so this in itself, to craft the tools and the workflows within the scope of the limitation of the current hardware and package everything, which slider do you need so that the end result visually when rendered, it looks like the real thing, but it's much more faster. Turnaround times are much faster. Is this something that you needed to explain a couple of times to people, or is there a certain intuition that this is how it works anyway? Because for me, I just came from the side of, well, now we have these super cool tools. They must be able to simulate everything physically. But then this was a little bit of a revelation for me. How did this happen to the TDs, or what was the experience with the people that you worked with? This balance.
Yeah, the balance of the tools with what they're trying to achieve. I mean, back then, because this was before, we didn't have fluids, we didn't have fire, we didn't have all of this stuff that we have now that would do it. So a bit of the code was trying to simulate what would happen naturally in physics. But with everything we're doing and even what we do now, ultimately, there's some story you're trying to tell. So you have to give the artist that control to help tell that story or that emotion or whatever is happening with that particular phenomena. But I think that's what can be missing sometimes if we talk about like people's portfolios and things like that. Well, they'll do a great explosion or they'll do a great simulation, but ultimately, in our jobs, we still have to tell a story. So that needs to be art directed. So how do you give the artist the control to say, I want the fire to rush here, or I want the tornado to bend this way, or I need it to feel more intense, that they need to be able to art direct physics. And back in the day, I kind of akin it to like, if someone asked you to float a leaf across the room and land on a table, but gave you a bunch of fans to do it, you know, how hard it would be to kind of maneuver those fans and stuff to get the exact result that you want. So I don't know if that's exactly answering your question, but I think it's you want that art directability to it. And you don't want the machine to dictate what the look is. Like when I first got in the industry, I asked my cousin who had been in the industry, like, what advice do you have? And he said, never let the machine dictate your work. So he's like, before you sit down, you should know what you're trying to achieve, because otherwise your work will just look like what has been coded, you know? Yeah. So, but to answer your question about how did we help the TDs with it, because I was sitting in a room with all these amazing like artists, like all of them have gone on to do all this amazing stuff. They would, and I was the intern, they would just say, hey, I need a tool to do this. Or can you make the debris, give me something to control how fast the debris spins, or you know, I need to be able to bend the tornado to look like a longer shape because the director wants to be able to shape this a certain way. So it was really fulfilling the stuff that they needed so that they could have the artistic controls to direct the work. And I think that continues to now as well.
Yeah. I think that still holds true that the computer is just a tool, or should just be the tool, right? And the storytelling should be the only moving force that kind of, let's say, generates the pixels. So what you just mentioned before, the leaf and the fans, and to basically art direct where the leaf should fall down on the table or so, just immediately reminded me of the scene of, what was the movie called?
Was it Forrest Gump?
Yeah, of course, Forrest Gump. So early in the morning here. Forrest Gump.
Was that what you're thinking about, or was that just my guess?
No, Forrest Gump. There's this one scene, I think it's pretty early in the movie, where this feather is basically flowing through the air and then kind of lands on his knee or something like that. And that was like mind-blowing because it looked absolutely real, right? But it was somehow magically done in the box, in the computer. I didn't track down how this was precisely done, but I mean, it's clearly computer graphics going on, and that was revolutionary back in the day, right?
Yeah, I can't remember. I think I knew the artist who worked on it, but I don't remember how they did it because they had done Forrest Gump shortly before we got there. But even then, like, we didn't even know, like, removing Gary Sinise's legs and stuff like that. All that stuff was revolutionary, but you know.
But that was it also done? I mean, it's a Spielberg movie. Were the visual effects for that also done at ILM? I don't remember.
Yeah,
that was ILM.
That was done at ILM. Yeah, so that was a time, and it was an interesting time to be there because there was so much computer graphics. It was just like exploding every year. There was something new that was being developed. So, and it just being the 30th reunion of Twister this year, I went to a thing at the Academy and we were talking about the film and stuff like that. So it's hard to beat. It's been that long.
I do remember I was also, when was the movie released?
It's 95, I think.
95. So I was 16 back then. And when I watched it, I also saw it in the cinema, I think. And I was blown away. This was literally also one of those. So Terminator 2, like the classics, Jurassic Park, but also especially also Twister was one of those movies that kind of influenced me of following or kind of slowly going in this direction with graphics and art and those technologies. So again, kudos to all of that work to you guys. All right. So we talked about your kind of during your education, you were starting your master's degree. You worked with particle effects. You worked with VR and so on. And then you got into ILM. But I think you mentioned to me you never finished that degree. And then how did the story continue?
Yeah. So at that time, because it was my master's degree and I was working and I stayed on with the project and I stayed for years because it was just like an amazing opportunity. And like I said, my biggest dream was just to do, like, I wouldn't say just, but I was saying was to do weather graphics and stuff like that. So to be able to work on these big films. So I ended up staying on at ILM for another 7 or 8 years working on Star Wars films and other Jurassic Parks and Perfect Storm and continuing, doing a lot of physics related and effects related work. And then it came up that my credits were about to expire that I had for my master's degree. So I thought it was a good time to take a break, go back to Chicago, finish off that degree, which took a little bit longer because I had to do a show and stuff like that. So when I went back to Chicago, we were doing more VR work. We were representing some neighborhoods in Chicago that were once very historic and had a lot of jazz history and African-American history. And we were representing them in the VR cave, which was this amazing setup they have. There's a newer one now, but, a 4-walled, 5-walled room where you could projections on the wall and just great VR. So I did that, but I also continued on. And then that's when I came down to Weta and I saw the amazing stuff they were doing for Lord of the Rings and Gollum and had a lot of friends here. I'd worked with Ken McGaw and Joe Lettieri and all of them at ILM. So I was like, well, maybe I'll come down for 6 months and work on Rings. And then I stayed for like 20 years or something. But it was similar, like a little bit of effects work, a lot of creature work. But the big project was for King Kong doing the procedural building of New York, which we've talked about a bit. That was probably, like I did the destruction of the Black Gates, which is at the end of Return of the King. Like me and the team did that. But it was when Kong came in that became probably one of the biggest research projects that I had to do.
Yeah. So kind of going back a small step, what influenced you in general to go to Weta? Was it kind of specific projects? Was it more the friends that you knew? What was the driving force to say, hey, let's fly to the other side of the planet almost? Yeah,
it was, it's a good question. Yeah, the driving force. I mean, part of it was at the time, with the work that they were doing on Gollum and Two Towers, like that was so far advanced, know, and that I did have, many friends down there and said, oh, there's a lot of innovation and interesting work. And it seemed like, an adventure to pick up and live outside the country. And as soon as it got in, it was, like I said, it was right in the middle of Return of the King. So everything was full going ahead. So that was kind of the inspiration for it.
Cool. Yeah, basically, so you're working as a VFX supervisor. So can you give us a little bit of an overview to the audience, to those that don't know what that is? So what your kind of daily work is, and then also expand a little bit on what the whole career path was over the 20 years within Weta. Kind of which role did you start as, and then how did you end up where you are at the moment?
So when I came here for Return of the King, I was working as, it's a role that I don't know if it even exists much anymore. It's called Sequence Supervisor, which was under the shots and lighting department, but it was slightly below being a CG supervisor where you look after a lot of the technical and artistic parts of a movie and work in conjunction with the visual effects supervisor. So this was slightly below. So you have like your lighting technical directors, and then above that you had your sequence supervisors, and then you had your CG supervisors. So I was somewhere in the middle there. And so for an example, when I came in, they said, we want you to look after the destruction of the Black Gates where the ground kind of sinks away and all the orcs at the end of Return of the King. So my job was then to start working with the compositing supervisor, to work with the lighting TDs, to work with the modelers, just work with everybody who's putting together and figure out how we were actually going to do that sequence. Digital environments, we were, at the time, that was heavily using a lot of miniatures. So we would have some rendered objects in the scene, but we also built pretty big miniatures as well for those environments. And it's kind of working through all those different teams and learning a lot to work out that entire sequence. So that was kind of the position I was in there. It dealt with dealing with shaders, effects, you kind of name it, everything that would go into those type of shots. But then my progression was, then I moved on this CG soup as I was working on films like King Kong because, like I said, that was the biggest project. We had two teams. We had a New York team and we had a Skull Island team, and I think that was mostly how we'd kind of broken it up. People who worked in the jungle and those who worked in the city. And when that project came in, and I was talking to the executive producer at the time, she said, we need to build 1933 New York. And Peter doesn't want it to be a matte painting because he wants it to be completely 3D that we can go anywhere. And we want to be able to fly around the city. It needs to be, we need to work out how we're going to procedurally build this whole thing. So that was working with, I had a team, like a couple programmers, Sambui, which was someone I was working with directly. And we just started literally just coding it up from how do you build a simple brownstone? How do you build a graystone? How do you build an office building? Things like that procedurally. And that was all done. It was just in Maya. I think the thing to take with, I guess, the King Kong build was that very few of that information was easily accessible. Like there wasn't the open street maps you could just download. We had a full-time librarian that all she did was find old fire maps that the firemen would do and keep track of how many people were in the building, what type of buildings they were, and these really old prints that she would scan in. We had black and white photos that we had to line up. We had census data from old books and stuff like that. So even just laying out the groundwork for growing the buildings took a ton of research. Yeah. It was just, you couldn't necessarily download any of that. And then we had to, because Peter's request was he wanted the skyline to be as close to 1930s accurate as we could. So the only way, we first looked at modern New York, but they had destroyed so many, they've rebuilt so much of it that there was no way to manipulate any kind of photography from modern New York. So we had teams of modelers, I don't know, it might have been 15 or 20, just lining up to maps and doing footprints and top print shapes of every building across the whole Manhattan Island, like 60,000 buildings.
It's an incredible feat, just the management of laying out what can be done kind of procedurally, where some information has to be filled in, fill the gaps. And on the other hand, also then specifically modeling probably dozens of landmark buildings.
Exactly. So there was like a dozen landmark buildings that were hand modeled, but the footprint stuff that you get from the open street map and those different, and then you get the extrudes on top. Just because we didn't have any of that, they had to hand model those levels. So they had there's people today it's called the beveled box club because that's all they did was boxes. and it was, like I said, it's before we even talk about any of the procedural code that I wrote, like the amount of man power and labor and stuff like that went into just building, like just getting all the data correct, where all the docks were and all of that across Manhattan, and it went into Brooklyn and Queens and everything.
Would you say playing the devil's advocate. Was it worth it? Was the effort worth the accurate representation? It's a hard question because I know if it comes from a director like Peter Jackson to say that's how we roll, right? So everything is for the sake of art. How far does this go? And where do people say, okay, this is crazy, nobody's going to see the detail? How is this? Because I heard for a long time this is kind of everything is dictated by the art and division at Weta specifically. But how is this balanced so that it doesn't kind of go completely overboard?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, what is the level that you take it to? And I think it actually goes back to your first question of what drew you to come down here to the company, is that things were taken to that very intense level. You would sit in dailies and it would talk about every little pore on the skin or how the light refracts through the eye and how hair grows and what's the thickness of each hair and how many hairs should be on a human head and all of those things. But and it sounds like it's overkill, but you do learn over the years that feeds the understanding of what's actually happening. I mean, there's two parts. One, everyone becomes more sophisticated because they don't know what's necessarily wrong, but it looks off. And it's probably because it's not doing exactly what your mind knows it should be. But I think the other part of it is, and I talked a little bit about this in a recent talk that I had, and this is what I learned back at undergrad, was that idea of learn the rules, then break them. Like that you have to understand it first, but then you definitely break it for the story or for the artistic purpose. But if you don't understand it first, you may spend all your time trying to figure out why it doesn't look real. You don't even get to the artistic part because you're just trying to make it not look phony, So if you can start with that foundation, then you've got a good baseline. And then you can spend it on the artistic part or on the cheats that you want to do. And to your question about New York, like I found that as well. When I wrote the procedural rules to go across all the buildings, I had very hard code that stop if you can't fit this window in or this is incorrect. But then I realized at a big wide scale, you're never going to see those things. So I loosened up the code to say, it's okay. Just keep going. Just keep doing, there may be areas we have to fix, may not be great, but having some flexibility in it. Trying to think if that best answers your question, but it is that digging really deep and understanding something helps, even if you aren't able to replicate or use all of it. And it also makes it a little bit more fun that you actually learn a lot about the subject, by doing it.
I just wanted to ask something regarding this process, because you just mentioned you learned a lot while doing it. What was the process for you to try and understand architecture and derive the procedural, so the code-based rules? What was your process, and were there maybe some aha moments in, an understanding of how architecture works? Or what can you describe because for me, that was when I was learning procedural modeling and myself being originally an architect. To me, it's an art form to take visuals, let's say data of a city, whether this is footprints, maps, or photographs, anything like that, or even concept sketches, and then trying to derive code-based or mathematical rules that describe not necessarily directly what you see, but the notion of it, the intent, the architectural intent that actually is the aspect of storytelling. That itself, to me, is like an art form. So how's that process for you, and were there any aha moments?
I think for me, I learned more about that after, to be honest.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was later on, because I was building so much en masse and our modelers were building by hand. They had a better, and some of them have an architectural background, they had a better understanding of those principles, and that's what you would see more up close and obeying those things, all the things that you probably know from having that architectural background. And at the time of doing that city, there was an element of it where it was just trying to get the thing to work, was part of it. Like, can it build a good brownstone, and can it do these type of things? But it was actually afterwards, and me learning a little bit more about other projects and working with things like City Engine and different, like in interviews and things afterwards, that I actually gained more knowledge about architecture. And then we started to collaborate with a architecture firm here in the city, and then just getting more and more of that knowledge. But I think the Kong thing was like a first foray into this procedural modeling, and it was projects afterwards. Because it's like you said, I mean, people who study this for their entire lives, there's so much more to it, that I could spend a lifetime just trying to even catch up with what they've studied. So
it kind of feels, for me, that's exactly what I'm doing. It's never going to end. It's just if you're dedicated to like myself, to just creating 3D environments with my business, or with even if it were just as a hobby, kind of 3D environments, and especially 3D architecture now, with the whole side of automation, it's endless. You even have the whole variety between, do you make stylized type of architecture for, let's say, more stylized video games, or do you make realistic video games that also need to have all of the optimizations like texture atlases and complex shader setups and so on? Or then do you go towards, let's say, the highest possible quality, almost hero quality for film? You cannot do everything at the same time. It's impossible, because you need such vastly different approaches. But it's such an interesting field, at least to me, and it also seems to you.
Yeah. And the thing that I'm particularly interested in as well is, and we did a little bit of this on Maze Runner, we did it in Kong as well, is like, after the architecture exists, how do you make it feel alive and lived in? How does it have a story that it can tell, even of itself, from it being there, or from the people who live there, or what's happened to it over time? Working with some students, I always say, like what is the story of this? What's the story of this place? Yeah, I was reading about different kinds of interesting architectural things where they were talking about, I don't know if it was in New Orleans, but in South, like, some places where they would build a step that's a little bit higher in your house. So if you had a burglar come in, they would always trip on that step and it could hear it, because you're used to that
crazy.
One higher step. Yeah, you're used to that. So you naturally step a little bit higher, but this little innovation, like the security thing, that they would always catch that step, like thing, just, or what would they call it? They're like witches' windows. There's like these windows in the Northeast that are at an angle, and they're windows that open at a diagonal, and there's like, it's not the real reason for it, but I think they're saying that they call them that because someone had theorized, if you're a witch, you have to turn on your broom at an angle to get into the window, so you can't come in at night.
Wow.
I think it's just odd. Like, I was curious about little architectural things that people put in that just gives a story to a place.
Are these things documented somewhere, these odd little things? Because I never heard about that people deliberately added different step heights. I know that they have to be very, very consistent in height, and even a millimeter or 2 millimeter will trip people. So to specifically add this to a building, I never heard that, but it's such an incredible detail. How did you find out about these odd things?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. It's just one of those things that people are talking about it, or it's like in a story, and that it took me to a thing, and then you read some history about it. And it's the same thing with the witch's window. I think I was trying to read about why there was diagonal windows like that, and there's a whole different theories of why those exist in the Northeast U.S. That's not the real reason. I think the witches thing, I think someone just made that up. But it's interesting stuff that exists.
This stuff should be in a book. This is so cool. This stuff
is so cool.
No, that's amazing. Well, so over the years at Weta, you must have been involved in the production of a lot more, production or creation of a lot more 3D environments. I mean, you mentioned Maze Runner, there was Alita. Obviously, for Planet of the Apes franchise, they were more organic, at least for on the ape side, for their habitat or for their cities. Can you talk a little bit more about different large-scale 3D environments that are maybe not so documented in making-ofs that you've seen? And kind of what would be the different challenges to them? So if you compare, for example, in the Hobbit movie, there's this huge blobby king.
Yeah, the Goblin Caverns. Yeah, worked on that.
The Goblin Cavern. So, I mean, that's also in itself is a city, but it has a completely different architecture. And I just was wondering, or even at the beginning of I think it was the first or second Lord of the Rings movie, where there's this camera, or where the orcs are starting to cut down the trees and start to prepare for war. And they throw the trees down to be cut up and burned so they can melt the iron and so on and start producing their weapons and so on. So there's also this kind of twisted camera move that goes down into the caverns, and you see all these wooden paths and so on. So that would be created, I would say, completely different than something like New York.
Yeah.
Right. So can you give us a little bit of an insight in the different, some examples and what the challenges you see or you were involved in with your work regarding this?
Yeah. I can talk a little bit about the environments, because I think that still goes back to your question I never finished about how I got to VFX souping.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, but this could potentially lead to that. Finishing off like some of the city environment work, one of the things I was interested in was like, how do you age a city? How do you make it rain or snow on it? So I had written some code as part of my master's that does procedural weathering, which kind of weathers all over things. And we use that for Maze Runner to make these kind of aged and dystopian, like apocalyptic cities. But for some of the other environments, like you mentioned, rings going in there with the orcs, those were done with miniatures back then with that one. But for the newer Hobbit films, we were doing environments. We were doing like CG environments. So the Goblin Caverns has all these complex kind of pathways, and the walls were supposed to be really corroded. Like they describe as them like defecating on all the walls, and it made it eat away as like this acid kind of thing. It's like, and the interesting thing was we did try to model all of that stuff on the computer, and we tried some procedural things, but actually what ended up working the best was we broke out some clay and had the artist just hand sculpt it. Like there was something you could get tactily out of a sculpture and made pieces that we could procedurally or hand put together, but the base sculptures came from something that was hand sculpted just because it gave an interesting organic look. Yeah, those type of environments. And there was another one you were asking about jungles and larger scale environments. Like how do we deal with larger environments? The thing that I learned the most on Lord of the Rings, I was working a lot with the art director, Alan Lee, who's this amazing artist, sketches and pencil and beautiful, and designed that whole Hobbit kind of world. And I would go and just visit him and hang out because there's just like a wealth of knowledge you could get from him. And he would take you into all kinds of things about creativity and how to be creative and stuff that I'd pick up on. But one of the things he mentioned was he was doing these little steps, and I was like, what's with the steps? And he said, I like to put in steps everywhere because rocks have no scale. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, if you look at a little rock and you look at a big rock, they're the same. We're in these Tolkien worlds and stuff like that. There is no scale cues, but having those steps, having a doorway, having an archway, your mind automatically knows that's how big a person is. So you'll see that all through Lord of the Rings. You'll just see these little steps going up things and things like that to bring the audience back. So to your question, I think we're always fighting scale. Like when you have these big, vast environments, how do you get the scale back to the audience? And because a lot of times you're asked to show even bigger than what could realistically happen. If we have underwater scenes like we had in Black Panther, you're seeing much further than you would never naturally be able to see. And big fly-throughs, like you said, a big sweeping camera moves that are probably faster than anyone could helicopter, safely through. So for the big environments, it's always like looking at how do we introduce scale that people can immediately recognize, because otherwise they'll just say it's not Yeah, it doesn't look real. There's a nice article a friend of mine wrote way back at ILM years ago where he talked about the primary, secondary, and tertiary scales that he would always put in all his models, that there's something very low frequency big, which is like maybe the side of the building. And then you've got your secondary, which is like the windows. And then you've got your tertiary, which is like the little pipes and the little things that give you that little scale. So anytime I'm looking at things, I'm always trying to figure out what's the primary, secondary, and tertiary. And are we missing one of those levels from this visual? And that goes for environments as well.
Just immediately reminded me of Tintin, kind of the chase sequence with this Tintin environment that also has kind of, it's so rich, this environment. Like every building looks completely different, and it looks incredibly organic and natural. All the distribution of all the elements are there that are necessary for storytelling and also obviously explaining the scale. It's just another one of those environments that it just came to my mind in the context of all the Weta environments that I'm aware of, at least.
Yeah, I think it's such an important part of it. And that's what I'd be curious in the future. Like I'm interested in, like, it's amazing what they're doing in video games with some of these environments, and the fact that you can interact with all of them, and how rich and lived in. Like, I think some of the amazing advancements is happening in those spaces. Like, the video game environments are so complex, what they're doing procedurally too is pretty incredible.
Absolutely. And they have to work as 3D
I know,
models, right?
Exactly.
Right, in VFX and film in general, you can cheat quite a lot because you have a kind of a fixed camera or a camera on a specific path, and you don't have this advantage in games.
Yeah, exactly. That you can go anywhere, and maybe it's because they've had to figure that out. That's also added to the organic nature of it, that things are live and distributed and can be pushed around. I mean, I'd love to learn more about how they go about building their environments.
From what I've seen, at least at the Rockstar and other companies like that, there's still, I mean, there is some proceduralism going on, but then there's like brute forcing it with tons of artists. So far. But what I just recently saw for GTA 6, of which the trailer was released a couple of months back, I think they even patented some workflows for interior generation for buildings. So there are some speculations that in this entire world, approximately, I saw some YouTube videos about it, and there's a little bit of speculation that approximately 70% of all the buildings that you see in the games have actually fully built interiors. Interiors. It's not just the whole city, right? And that's mind-blowing. But I mean, Rockstar being Rockstar, right? So
they're going to cover
that stuff is fantastic. But I mean, that's like literally the production of something like this is hundreds of millions of US dollars. Literally, right? And I've had so many discussions with people, or with, let's say, potential clients also. Well, I want to go in this direction. And then you ask, or what are the references? Well, this game or that game. And then you ask,
it's like,
are you aware of the budget? And then they say, no, I have no idea, but it quote unquote must be easy, right? Or maybe not easy, but well, it's a game, so it should be possible. Well, yeah, not really, right? I mean, just a few months ago, I checked the budget for Assassin's Creed. So they have about 11 or 12 or so games out at the moment, and the combined budget, obviously the budget going up with each production, $1.8 billion US dollars. For 11 games, right? And they're constantly building on the last engine, and they can reuse parts, or in some cases they can reuse rigs, they can reuse textures. Maybe they change the theme to go from, I don't know, from geographic location. You change a lot of stuff, and you have to throw out a lot of stuff. But still, you're just building on the expertise of the last project. So it's incredible how much money goes into these modern game worlds.
Yeah, exactly. And how many years go into it? Because
20 years, right?
Yeah. And people say, this game hasn't been released in like 8 or 9 years. It's like they've just been working on it the whole time, you know?
It's super fascinating.
Some of my career progression was environments, was definitely an interest, and also character work as well. And then more recently, it's been effects related. So my progression to VFX Soup came from working on films like Avatar, Water Horse, Kong, Hobbit, multiple Hobbit films, Lord of the Rings. So with each movie taking on more and more responsibility, looking after a bigger section of the film until eventually reaching visual effects supervisor, where you're looking after. I mean, on some of the big movies now, you have multiple VFX supervisors because there's so many shots to look after. But looking after a large chunk of the overall effects for the show.
Very, very cool.
Yeah.
So how does your work influence the Weta pipeline?
I think, we're always innovating on the pipeline. That's definitely part of it. I guess to probably best answer that question might be related to more some of the recent work. Like a lot of work recently has been in water. As you know, water has become a big thing that Weta is doing. We had for Avatar: The Way of the Water, there was a lot that was done for that, and a lot of recent films, Naiad, Ripley, Jungle Cruise, Black Panther, you name it. So we started digging more into and rebuilding our whole water pipeline several years ago. We'd always had different software and applications, but we just wanted to rebuild the entire thing from the ground up. So for me on that project, I was a VFX supervisor looking at the development process. So looking at what tools we were building, how they would work in production, how the artist would use them with a large team, simulation scientists and CG supervisors and comp supervisors, just a lot of people. But giving it a VFX supervisor perspective, knowing that we have to use this, almost coming full circle to what I was saying with Twister, that it has to be something that has to work in production and it has to be artist friendly, and trying to keep that perspective on it. But that was at least, I think, 2 years of research, just heavy research from the ground up, and then working it in different productions. And I learned a lot about water through that. Like you almost have to.
Yeah, I mean, water is probably one of the most complicated elements that have to be spot on to look realistic.
Because everybody knows what it looks like. I know. Yeah. Fire can be a bit like that too. But water is a bit less forgiving, especially the subtleties of it.
Yeah, I remember from one of the presentations that you actually gave that I listened to or that I saw with, what was blowing my mind is that there are kind of the different types of waters in the different oceans on the planet, depending on pH levels, kind of the amount of salt that is in the water flow, temperature, all of those aspects. And then the most mind-blowing aspect was depending on the depth of the color wave spectrum, which colors are kind of fading out further with depth.
Yeah.
And this is mind-blowing.
Yeah. And all of that, and that's the thing, is that I think when people think a lot about effects, or particularly water, and they think a lot about simulation, which is very important, to get it simulating and moving and correct. But there's so much that goes into just the rendering and light properties of it. That's the part that we quickly forget, that's a huge component. What makes it look like water is how the light moves through it and what do the objects look like within it. We were looking at we did our digital doubles of characters and people swimming in water. Like the way the light goes through your skin and exits in water is different the way it exits in air. So you actually look a little bit glowier underwater, and there's all kinds of things that optical properties that are happening that is a huge component that you have to figure out.
So with the first Avatar, I read that for the avatars, they have blue skin, right? So from what I read, it was one of the biggest challenges was that they actually kind of, independent of whether they are in water or in a forest or at night, that they that the color of their skin actually feels blue. And rendering this was a huge challenge back then, and I think a lot of may have also needed to be fixed in post or in comp. Now, continuing with Avatar 2 and beyond that, how much of this just light scattering and so on, how much of that stuff is kind of, you would say, is physically simulated because you have the maths pinned down in the shader versus what are the tweaks or kind of what is the percentage, quote unquote, of sliders that the artist has to play with to kind of push reality a little bit to make it appear, let's say just the skin color, to make it absolutely look correct?
I think the difference between the first Avatar and the more recent one is we've definitely had huge advancements in rendering. Like there was a lot of optimizations that we would do back then. And like you were talking about the skin color, I can't even remember what we called it. We did have a special thing to help with like spectral compensation or something to deal with, you know, if you were to light it with a red light, what does that do on blue skin? Things like that. But now over years, we built our own new renderer, which is a spectral render. We were actually doing more with the wavelengths of light and what it actually does versus just red, green, and blue. So we've advanced the renderer quite a lot, but we've also advanced like understanding materials a lot more, like how does, you know, and taking the time to let the light calculate and do the proper thing. How does it get absorbed or what gets scattered or what bounces back into your through reflection? In terms of with our look development department, they spend quite a bit of time testing these materials in the different environments so that hopefully by the time it gets to the artist, like, okay, we're going to set up this Na'vi skin, but we're going to do it in firelight. We're going to run it out in water, above water, daylight, you know, all of the different conditions to try and get good baseline so it works well in that. There may be some tweaking you have to do, but hopefully you try to minimize that as much as you can, that you have a material that actually works the way it should. But there's always this artistic part, and sometimes it just comes with lighting. Like I think about the Apes films, we worked on those. It took a while for the artist to figure out, like, you have to light a chimpanzee different from a gorilla because of the shape of the brow and how you want the light to hit them in the expression. One of our lighting artists gave this great lecture on just how to light eyes to get a certain expression, like where a highlight falls on your pupil can either give you a kind of piercing look or it can give you kind of, you've seen in anime, they use very big highlights that are kind of cutesy, you know, if they want to do that. Like just the way a highlight hits an eye can make a difference on what that expression is you're conveying to the audience. So lighting itself can be an art in just getting that story across. There's a lot of lighting that goes into those type of films, those heavy creature moments.
Talk about storytelling, right? And emotion, especially.
Emotion, yeah, exactly. If you have a character that's just staring at the screen and it's all synthetic, and so there's a lot of work just making it look real, but it's also like, okay, how does it convey those emotions? Yeah, it's got to feel like, it's got to engage with the audience. They've got to emote and have a reaction, you know, from the viewer.
Yeah. So what's your typical day at the moment at Weta?
Mine will be a mix of things. Like it's in my position, it'll be some days are spent figuring out how to break down a film from a script and figuring out what the cost will be and the kind of bidding out like what the effects will be. So you might just have a simple line in the script which says, I don't know, character comes around the corner and sees a destroyed city, you know, smoke and fire rages off in the distance. And you need to be able to take that line, break down what the techniques would be, how much is it going to cost, how long would it take, how would you develop, you know, taking all of that from the written word of the script. So some of my days are involved with that. Other parts will be with going in and meeting on a particular project. If I'm supervising that one, we have dailies where we come in and see all the work that was rendered that night, meet with the different artists and talk about what our next steps will be to achieve the look that the director wants. Can be meeting with art department. One thing I'd point out is we still, with our art department, we're not just digital. We still have where we practically build things and break things and make molds and try stuff to solve that problem. And so I could have dailies where I'll meet with simulation artists and lighters and compositors and basically working to put together the image. Then I'm just thinking about even what I had to do today. And then I may have development meetings with the technology and research division. And I think that's one part that you may not hear enough about, that there's lots of people who are from the technical side that are writing all these tools. You know, a lot of times we have presentations and we talk about the tools or we talk about the artists and stuff like that, but there's a large group of people that are from computer science backgrounds, architecture, physics backgrounds that are building all these tools that we're making. So I could be meeting with their groups and seeing what they're developing new and what's next on the horizon for stuff that we need to look out for with all the new tech. And, you know, like I said, I'll meet with different artists throughout the day. And then sometimes at the end of the day, we'll need to send off to the client. So it's putting all the images together, all the shots together, and send it off for a call that I'll have with the client the next day about to talk about the work and get direction from them. So a little bit of everything.
Cool. I would say let's switch to a little different topic also. So kind of for traveling. Let's talk about traveling. How often, in your role as a VFX Soup, how often do you travel in a year? And kind of to trips or to international conferences for presentations and so on?
Yeah, so traveling as a soup, because we're in New Zealand, a lot of our locations there's a lot that's filmed here, but there's also a lot that's going to take place in the States or in Europe or Australia. So I travel quite a bit, and that could be to go on set for some of the filming and some of the location work to make sure that we have a presence there and working with the film crew of getting all the data and all the information back for us for the effects that we have to do. Or there could be conferences like, SIGGRAPH or FMX, which I like to go to because I like working with the students and talking to them. This kind of goes back to what I was saying before of just having someone who came to our school and kind of gave us excitement about going out into industry, hoping to do the same. So a bit of that and hopefully a little bit of holiday in there once in a while too. But the traveling part, is part of the... Yeah, I think it's the interesting part is just being able to go to these different locations and to do that.
So the sets, they are, I assume, pretty much all over the world.
Yeah, they could be. They could be filming in South Africa, Germany, London, US, Australia, you name it. Africa, yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty appealing... It's tough. It's physically tough, right? But this definitely is an appealing aspect to the work, which also changes up a lot of things.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point because it's another thing that we probably don't talk about as much, but I remember giving a talk in Savannah, Georgia years ago, and I gave a whole part of the presentation on the on-set work, like the people who are out there capturing all this data and scanning, and some students came up and said, this is great, we never hear about it, but being an outdoor person, that's what I want to do. I don't want to be on a computer all day. Yeah. But to think about like any effects work that's done from a filmed location, all of that data needs to come back for the hundreds of people who are going to work on those shots who never got a chance to go there. So we have teams that are LiDAR scanning and photographing and doing everything they can to capture as much of that data as they possibly can for those who can't get out there and to build the shots. So it's an important part that we don't hear as much about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've talked to multiple guests on the podcast regarding very specifically or also very deliberately about the lesser known things. Also, one of the main motivations for that is for the people that listen to the podcast, especially younger people, that they get a deeper insight into the different types of roles which may help them with career choices and specifically addressing kind of what will await you, because there are so many things that you don't learn through your standard education, through your standard degree. But I think it's really, really important to address those things, and not only the negative sides like long work hours and all of that stuff, but also kind of the positive things, and to move them into the kind of this conscious field of vision so people can make informed decisions about their career. And not just, I want to be a 3D artist and I have no idea what this actually means.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's one of my biggest points when I work with them is that, if you can find out about the other jobs, because you hear about animators, you hear about lighters, that's mostly what you hear about. And you might hear about compositors, but there is so many other careers like color grading, very important. Like your thing might be color. And it's almost like if there's something that you have an interest in and you geek out about, there may be a career in that particular thing. You'd be surprised at how specialized or useful some of these skills can be. There's fur groomers who just do fur, hard surface modelers, people who make ships, who make really good ships. There's such a variety there that it's good for people to explore.
And if it doesn't exist, why not just try and go for it? And maybe a position like that will be created, right?
Exactly.
That's awesome. So let's stay a little bit on this side of kind of taxing things, the good things and the bad things. Let's talk a little bit about health and especially also mental health. So how do you personally handle stress? To me, it's mind-blowing pretty much. I'm not sure how people in positions or in jobs like you, whether the ability of handling stress consciously has something to do with where it comes from, or if it has to do with also, intelligence to be able to process complex situations much faster. I don't know where it's coming from. So I'm really curious about how you handle it personally.
Stress. Yeah. And I think it's always a tricky question because I think everybody thinks they don't handle it that well. I don't know. Because everyone gets that level of stress. We had a similar, like VES had me on a podcast where they worked, like we talked with different therapists and stuff like that, talk about this idea of mental health within visual effects. And we did go through that topic, like how do you handle it? I think everyone handles it differently. For me, there's a couple things that I try to do. One is that it's important that we make great work and we do a great job, but it's also I don't work in a hospital. I don't I'm not a policeman. I'm not, like I said, it's very important that we do great work, but I also have to keep it in perspective too of what, like I do actually have friends who work in a hospital and they tell me about their days and I'm like, okay, well, I can tone down my stress a little bit about the things that I'm working with. But my type of working with teams and kind of my upbringing is that I try to have a contribution throughout the team. I don't necessarily completely a top-down hierarchy structure. Like if you can get everyone involved in the process and you can make them feel heard, usually the things that's stressing you out is you don't have an answer to a problem that's facing you. But if you can create an environment where everyone feels like they can contribute, there's a good chance that somebody in the room might have a good answer for you. So lessening that stress by having everybody feel like they can participate. If you create an environment where it's just top down and I'm the only one who has to come up with the answer, then I think that increases the stress. I think there's building teams that have that can help with it. The other thing I guess I would say would be, I'm actually been listening to a lot of different podcasts. There's such a wealth of information out there that wasn't there 10 years ago. It feels like anything that a lot of stress comes from the unknown, but it seems like anything you want to do, you can search online and someone's talking about, has a master class on that type of thing. It's just amazing how much is out there. So when I try to get stressed out about it, it's like, well, is this just a lack of knowledge? And is there something I can go to, a place I can go to help reduce that knowledge or call on friends?
That's definitely a big advantage of the current times that we're living in, like YouTube and all the other locations where you can find these things. But what I took from your answer, I think, and that's to me, that's a completely new aspect of that dealing with stress or handling stress is not necessarily a thing that is just has to be solved with you, but it depends on your peers. So it's not a task for an individual, but it's kind of a group task that influences only one person. I think that's really, really important. I mean, we're all aware of kind of that you want to work as a team, you want to solve the problem as a team, and you don't want to put too much pressure. You want intrinsically motivated people. But also that this notion that you just mentioned, this also trickles down in the aspects of personal stress management. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, it's the part that, and like I said, I'm no like guru or haven't figured out, because it is like, everyone's trying to figure out the mental health and stress thing. But it does feel like that's the times when you ask the question to help me out the most. Like even, when we ran into each other at FMX, the time between my talk in Kenya and this talk that I had at FMX, I was kind of stressing about the talk, like how am I going to make this a good talk? How am I going to
remember?
It wasn't coming together. It wasn't like, it didn't feel like every time I'd go through it, it didn't feel right. And I just started chatting with a friend of mine who's in Paris, and I was just like, I'm stressing about a talk. And he just gave me some good advice. He was like, okay, you need to personalize it some more. You need to, make it a bit vulnerable about what things go right and what things go wrong. And he just gave me some good advice. I integrated all of it in. I liked the way the talk was, and it ended up becoming a fun event. And I think it goes back to that, what's that old saying, the same mind that creates the problem has trouble solving it, or something like that. It's something like an old Einstein quote or something like that. The mind that creates it may have trouble solving it. So it's like outsourcing some of that to other people, and how much they, from their removed position, can give you some good advice to help reduce that.
And even just the example that you gave is mind-blowing to me, that a person like you that worked on so many very, very technical problems and Hollywood movies and all of the most complex productions, still there's this really, really human notion of, I'm struggling with a presentation. To me, this is mind-blowing, right? I mean, and I think this is so cool to be able to openly kind of talk about these things, because I see a lot of those things in just this one example, and also in myself, in my own shortcomings and deep vulnerabilities. And it gives me perspective that you cannot be great in everything.
No.
Right? Yeah. Even though I want to be.
I know, we all want to be, but it's you can't be. And but I think it's knowing that all that stuff is just natural. Like even though I've done years and years and years on this water research, the thing I was trying to figure out is like, how do you connect that with an audience and talk to other people about it helped. I had it when I gave talks like years ago, when I first started giving talks, I had trouble giving those presentations. You get nervous on stage and all those things that come with giving talks. And I had a friend, and I gave this talk in Georgia, and it was another one that I was stressed out about. It was going to be a big one. It was, several thousand people, stuff like that. And it was interesting because I went into he said, meet me at the hall a little bit early. And I said, okay, cool, I'll meet you there. And he's like, okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to walk around and sit in all the seats of the hall. And he walked and he had me sit down in all the different seats of the hall. And then he said, okay, and then when people start coming in, I want you to talk to the people in the front row as they're coming in. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And then I gave this talk, and it was like one of the most fun and most enjoyable talks, and actually got rid of generally most of any stage fright I had before that. And I said, you know what, that worked great. What was that? And he said, you'd be surprised how much the space actually affects your nervousness. And I can't believe if we might have talked about this before. And he's like, people forget that being in a new physical space can make you nervous. So by sitting in all the chairs, you could see the stage from that perspective. You get a sense of the room. And then he said, when the people come into the front row, generally those are the people who are most interested in the talk. They've got there early. They're getting a front row seat. And just by talking to them, you start the conversation going. And then if you ever, during your talk, ever forget something or get a little nervous, just look at them, because they're there rooting for you. you know. But it was interesting just that those little advice, like so many people have so much different things they can share with you that, yeah, if you can take advantage of it, maybe that can reduce the stressful stuff we have to do.
Piggybacking on that, even though we have all of these new types of media around that can help us with any type of issue, how would you start to kind of break the social stigmas attached to the discussion around mental health?
I think it's just talking about it more. You know, that was kind of good about the VES program it did, was just that it becomes a discussion. I think it does need to be more out there. Like, it shouldn't be a surprise that I think it shouldn't be a surprise that I would stress out about a talk that I'd have to do later. You know, that's something I should be able to bring up. And I might have even said it to you guys in Kenya or something like that. But it should be like, it's so natural and so human that a lot of it is because we're all dealing with the same thing, but we don't really talk about it as much. And we don't have enough forums to talk about it. I think there has been an element of, you know, where it used to be after work, you'd go to the pub and you'd see the same group and you could discuss those kind of things, or you could, you know, but we have such, with our modern living, that you do your work and you go home and then you do more work and then, you know, and you get into that cycle. There's not a lot of opportunity to actually have those conversations. So I guess the question is, how do we have, like, I mean, you're starting it here with this here, but how do we have more of those conversations?
I'm doing this very, very consciously, addressing those issues. And I think also more and more. And so far, every episode that I was recording, it's not about the technical stuff, like the button pressing of the 3D tools, right? It's so much more about the creativity, the arts, and the physical and mental state and the philosophy that goes around that enables you to be able to create art or 3D environments in our case, right? And so I think it's incredibly important. Also, the other notion of what is a career? What does it mean? We talked about this earlier, right? Yeah, just addressing those things. And also that the pandemic didn't help in the sense of that, or after it, I think going to the pub together when working from home office, a little bit of that also got lost, which doesn't help with solving those social issues or those mental health discussions, right?
Exactly. The other thing I think I would add, which I've been thinking about more recently, is that we also being conscious of these newer jobs where we're at computers all day, or we're focusing on a certain thing. We're very quick to list all the physical things that you have to be careful of, your neck, your posture, your RSI, all of those different things. But I don't think we probably discuss as much the mental things that can also get fatigued. You know, with doing a good job at something, you might also have to really fixate on something and study it over and over and over again. But what is some of the mental drain or patterning that can come from that may also affect mental health? So I think it's almost like saying that it has to be brought to the same level as the way we discuss having proper ergonomics, you know, that you can do as much there can be mental damage done as well as physical if we're not looking at these things.
I wholeheartedly agree to that. So what would you say are the really important things in life?
Oh, jeez. Yeah. Yeah. It jumps to the bigger questions.
Yep. Let's go to philosophy.
Yeah. A sense of purpose, I think, helps. I think that also goes back to your mental health question, that as I get older, when your purpose starts to shift more toward maybe the next generation or helping others or things like that, that makes it more enjoyable. You know, it's not just making another film. It might be making a film that tells a story about an unrepresented group, or it might be something that it's full of you know, I liked working on Umbrella Academy because they were quirky, oddball characters that I met a lot of people that were like, we love the show because they related to being the odd kid out, you know, that type of thing. So I think finding a purpose with your purpose is a big thing for life. Family, relationships, of course, those are all of it. And if you don't have your health, that makes it kind of hard to.
It's impossible.
Yeah, with the other things. Yeah.
So, kind of to balance things outside of work, how do you find a balance? What types of hobbies are you pursuing?
I think I should be better at it, to be honest with you, with the relationship between outside and inside work. Like that part can be something I can improve on because, with work and all, you can get to a level where it's harder to do that stuff outside because it takes, a fair amount of energy. I have been trying to, work out more physically, like trying to read a bit more, trying to travel. Like travel seems like that's the big thing that helps a lot. There was, something I was listening to the other day about how you can feel like you're stuck in a rut because the mind naturally gets used to the things that it's seeing and doing. But just traveling away and coming back can make that fresh again, like going to that restaurant because you've been gone for 2 weeks. So if we naturally get into those ruts of where we don't appreciate things, maybe a little bit of time apart can help, bring back that interest.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. So I would say let's dive into the last 3 questions that I always ask. If you have to recommend a book everybody should read, which one is it and why?
It's hard to say if everyone, because I've just started reading it myself. And I don't know if it's like, I know like there's creativity book, like the one I recommended for some artists there's a Loomis illustration book, which I thought was great for artists. But in terms of the book I'm reading now is a difficult read. The book is called Caste. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning book, and I'm only partway through it. But it's an interesting take on her breaking down some of society's problems based on that each society makes its own kind of caste system. And it's a really interesting of putting people in different levels and stuff like that. But it's an interesting way of, it's not appropriate necessarily for the stuff we've been talking about here earlier, but I just find it fascinating because it's from a society point of view. And it puts the problem as being something that's systematic. Like, so you're not necessarily demonizing any certain groups or anything like that. And I just find it fascinating when systems can be our problems versus individuals and things like that. Because as this whole thing is talked about, I'm interested in systems. I'm also interested from like how are systems making that we are all feeding into, making things difficult for all of us. It's not the because I know like some of the other because I've listened to other podcasts and stuff that you had on here were more creative art books, but this one's different just because I haven't been reading.
It can be anything. That's cool. So if you could change one thing on this planet to make it a better place, what would that be? That's
an equally hard one. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of stuff you change, but it feels like there's a little bit of a lack of hope. Like it feels like if we could have more, it feels like we've entered this time where people feel like things are going a certain way and there's not much I can do about it, and we're losing a little bit of hope. Where even being like a kid growing up in the Cold War and stuff, there was around Washington, D.C., there was scary thoughts about what the future could be in arms races and nuclear. But those were possible futures, but it wasn't like that had to be our future. But it feels like there's a little bit of a like we're all going this way and there's not much we can do about it. So I think if I could change anything, it would just be more that kind of optimistic hope that things can be, we can make like a better, situation for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, if the only person that you can control to change something is you, right? So if I just thought about the answer that after recording episodes of this podcast, just the reply that I would give just basically came to my mind right now. And so what would you change? Well, I would change myself.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because that's the only thing I can truly influence. I cannot influence other people. Other people are other people, but I can become a kind of. Meanwhile, I think it's a bit cheesy, this term of the your better self or your best self,
Mm-hmm.
because it has this negative connotation of all of the health and all of the gurus types out there, right, that want to sell you courses.
Yeah.
But I think because it's, just working on yourself and trying to be aware of what is positive and negative can help tremendously.
Yeah. Yeah. That intention for better. Yeah, exactly. And it probably is there. I just think it'd be nice if there was more of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the kind of last question, who would you like to see as a guest on the 3D Environment podcast?
It'd be cool if there was more. Well, you probably had them. I mean, I saw the different names and listened to a couple different ones, but some art directors as well. You know, there's some amazing art directors out there that may not necessarily be as much on the procedural side, but just their thought processes of that could be really, I think, could be great for your talk, for the podcast. Yeah.
Art directors. Note it down.
Yeah.
Note it down.
Yeah.
All right. No, then let's wrap this baby up and
Yeah. And then we'll chat again soon whenever the next conference or time or whenever you're on this side of the world. Hopefully I'll be over there at some point.
Yeah. We'll definitely meet again. Thank you so much. And also to the people in the background that made this possible today. So thanks for all the inputs and say have a great and fantastic day.
Yeah, you too.